Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Sheldon, we have another foreign policy debacle. Not surprisingly, another debacle associated with the interventionist philosophy. I'm referring, of course, to Iraq, which is about as close to full-scale civil war as one can get. And, I'm just tempted to say, I told you so, or we told you so. I mean, we libertarians were among the principal people back in 2002 that were arguing against this intervention. And we caught so much flack from people. We had tons of people that were sending us hate mail, canceling donations, and so forth, that Iraq had WMDs, that Saddam Hussein was about to unleash WMDs, mushroom clouds on American cities. And that was really the original justification. People forget about this, that when they're talking about this big nation-building enterprise and they're all now pointing their fingers at each other as to who's responsible for losing Iraq and stuff, they forget that the original justification for this was a self-defense measure. That Saddam Hussein was going to use WMDs to unleash, mushroom clouds in American cities. And that's what really got the American people all hyped up, that we have to go to war. This is a defensive measure. This is a preemptive attack on a nation that's just getting ready to attack us. And we libertarians said it's all bogus. It's all bogus. That even if there were some WMDs left over from the 1980s that the United States delivered to Saddam when they were partnering with him in his war against Iran, there was absolutely no chance that Saddam was going to unleash WMDs on the United States. It was just ridiculous from the inception. But that's the excuse they used. And then when they didn't find the WMDs, they didn't come home. They didn't say, we're sorry we made this mistake, which really reflected that this whole thing was a nation-building exercise. And that nation-building exercise now lies in tatters. Not surprisingly, this is the way all their little foreign interventions work. So we're not surprised, but I'm tempted to say we told you so back in 2002, and that's why you got this total mess. My question is, how can any American continue to subscribe to this interventionist philosophy? It just makes no sense to me, especially given what's going on in Iraq and to a certain extent Afghanistan.
Yes, well, we were among a core group of people that did warn against this. I take no satisfaction in saying we told you so, because it's a horrible thing that's going on over there, which I think is completely attributable to George W. Bush's invasion in 2003, but actually should be traced back to his father's attack on Iraq in 1991 after Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait. And I noted this morning that in the fall of 2002, about 6 months before the invasion, or about that, the head of the Arab League, who happened to be an Egyptian back then, Amr Moussa, said that a military strike on Iraq would open the gates of hell. That's a quote. And he said it again after the invasion occurred. I think they ended up getting whipped into line by George W. Bush, because the U.S., of course, gives a lot of aid to a lot of those countries in the Arab League, certainly the leading one. So people had warned about this, and there was the officials, the neoconservatives, and the brain trust around Bush and his brilliant whiz kids. Well, they weren't so young, so I guess we can't call them kids. They were so cocksure about what was going to happen when they went in. You're right, they lied about the reason to go in. Wolfowitz himself, Paul Wolfowitz, who was working under Rumsfeld, conceded later that the only reason they coalesced around WMD was that was the only thing they thought the public would buy. He knew there was plenty of disagreement within the intelligence community about all that. Scott Ritter, who was a former inspector, was debunking it and saying there are no WMD there. But those people were not about to have their minds changed. They wanted this war. They thought it was going to. It just shows you how guilty people can be of wishful thinking. They thought if they knocked out Saddam Hussein, somehow some good was going to happen. And I think they just were at that point were closing their eyes, crossing their fingers, and saying, "Don't worry, this will work out." I know people find it hard to believe that policymakers operate that way, but they're not any different from anybody else, and people often do that sort of thing, like just give me this and somehow it will work out. And we see what happened. We were right, the non-interventionists were right, Ron Paul was right, and yet the narrative is being controlled by the interventionists. If you look at the media, I watched a lot of the media over the weekend, all the various networks, you don't see non-interventionists being brought on to talk about what went wrong. You see the same usual suspects from the neocon crowd and the existing administration and Mitt Romney. You see all the people that got it wrong as the go-to people, and I haven't seen any non-interventionist come on to be asked to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean they've got a vested interest in trying to protect their little asset here, and this was going to be their model society. I think that when they invaded this country with the idea of effecting regime change, they really thought they were going to show the world what interventionism could do. That this was going to be their model society. They were going to remake the Middle East, and they were going to install their kind of favorite regime, modeled after the national security state apparatus, which they always do when they invade these countries. They want to install a great, big, powerful military. And so they immediately start, they fired the old military and they start redoing the military, and they're going to, strong military force, just like the United States, just like Egypt, big national security state apparatus, torture chambers, surveillance schemes, indefinite detention. I mean, this guy, Maliki, has just been a brutal dictator. And you can call him democratically elected if you want to, fine. But that doesn't preclude dictatorship. We see that in Latin America, where people have the, quote, freedom to elect their dictator every 4 years or so. This guy's been brutal. Torture chambers, indefinite detention, incarceration, killing people, in large part with the assistance of the Pentagon and the CIA throughout the years of the occupation, killing people who were resisting this dictatorship. And so you can tell with some of these the cities that are being taken over by the insurgents and the rebels, people are like celebrating it. Until they realize that this outfit's just as brutal, if not more so, than the Maliki regime. I mean, it's a horrible choice people have there. But this is what interventionism does. We see it time and time again. Look at the Iran intervention back in '53. It's a success story, quote, success story for 25 years when the U.S. has its dictator, the Shah, in power. Then there's a brutal revolution in response to this, and the U.S. acts shocked. Oh, these are bad people for ousting a pro-U.S. dictatorship. And finally, let me say that your point about the Persian Gulf War is very interesting, because when George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, intervened in that conflict, it was like a dream come true. The Cold War had ended. People were asking, what do we need the big national security state for? They were talking about a peace dividend. And all of a sudden, boy, here's Saddam Hussein, the new Hitler, they called him. So, boy, they garner up this big support to invade during the Persian Gulf War. But they don't go all the way to Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein. Well, that provided people, the neocons and the interventionists throughout the 90s with this new official enemy, Saddam. And I remember those years. I mean, you never heard anything about communists or terrorists or Islamofascists, none of that. It was all Saddam. And so finally, 9/11, everybody was so scared after the 9/11 attacks that Bush knew he could bring up any kind of bogus reason to do what he thought his dad should have done. And people warned him, including us libertarians, you go into this country, you kill untold numbers of people, you're not going to come out of this with a model society of a paradise of freedom and prosperity, which Bush and the Pentagon and the CIA thought they were going to bring into existence. You are going to produce a hellhole. And that's really what they've done here, Sheldon.
Yeah, it's only in comparison with George W. Bush that the George H.W. Bush team, like Scowcroft and Baker, look sane. They're the so-called realists. Colin Powell back then was made a point of saying that let's remember, he called it the Pottery Barn rule, although Pottery Barn claims it's not its rule. If you break it, you bought it. If you break it, you own it. So they at least knew that if you go in there and take out Saddam's government, you now own the chaos. You're responsible for everything, and everything's on your head, and you better go in, full. I don't even think this would work, but at least they had some sense of the idea that you better go in and take charge of everything, because you can't just go in and knock out a regime. I mean, societies are very complex. I mean, I'll give Powell and those guys credit for understanding that a society is extremely complex. You don't even grasp the whole of your own society, much less a society that has a completely different culture, different religious sects, different ethnic groups. To think you can go in there, remove the head, of the government, remove the government, and just nicely remake things so that things are otherwise going to remain orderly. And they were orderly under Saddam. We can concede that much. He was a dictator, but you didn't have the sects fighting each other. To think you can go in, make a change in the regime, and everything else is going to go just fine is nuts. And at least the H.W. Bush people seem to understand that, and which is why they didn't go. Now, there were sanctions. They made other bad mistakes. They maintained sanctions, which then were taken up by the Clinton administration and intensified. In fact, Clinton even announced at one point that the sanctions wouldn't end merely with the proof that there were no WMD, because there were UN inspectors in there at the time. He said they won't end until there's regime change. Well, that in a way was a game changer, because it told Saddam, there's no way I have to commit suicide in order to end the sanctions. And, no leader of a nation is going to do that. No ruler of a nation is going to do that. So he just had an interest in digging in, and that set the stage for George W. Bush's attack, which then, as Amr Moussa put it, opened the gates of hell. And there might have been some lull, in 2006, 7, and 8, and a little past that, which John McCain and others want to attribute to the U.S. surge, but we actually know what created that lull in violence. Namely, the U.S. government enabled the Shiites to complete the sectarian cleansing of Baghdad, which went from 50-50 Shiite and Sunni to 85-15 Shiite and Sunni. So the violence died down merely because they drove most of the Sunni out. And then the U.S. military, the CIA, did what the Sunni warlords in the northwestern part of the country had already been asking for. Namely, they said, give us the money, stop killing us, and we'll go after the Al-Qaeda types. They didn't like the Al-Qaeda types. A lot of them were foreigners, so they weren't Iraqis, and they didn't like the violence and the Sharia that they talked about. So they killed off a lot of Al-Qaeda, drove them out, or drove them underground. So you got this lull in violence, which then the McCain types could claim was the result of the brilliant surge of, Petraeus. And he still says that to this day. He says the war was won in 2006 and 7. And so, now we've squandered all the gains. That's what McCain says. But it wasn't that at all. It was just waiting for, it was bound to rise up again, especially with Maliki, as you say. But Maliki was not the one to start the purging of the Sunnis and the Baathists from the government and the army. That was Paul Bremer. That was the U.S. government. That was the viceroy appointed by Bush to go in and govern like a colony, Iraq. They kicked the Sunni out of their jobs. And so what did they do? They went home and they were receptive to an insurgency because they had been kicked out of their jobs and they couldn't make a living, no income. So what are you going to do? You're going to blame the new administration, which was this Shiite Iran allied government, which everybody knew in advance it was going to be, because the majority in the country are Shiite. It was a mess from beginning to end. I really do agree with Tom Friedman. I don't usually agree with him at the New York Times, where he said the reason they went into Iraq was not any of the reasons they gave us. It was after 9/11, they needed to kick some Arab butt. That's what he said. It was just to show the American people that we could go in and beat up on Arabs after 9/11, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11.
Yeah, that's the point that's always hit me, is that of all the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis that they killed, and we don't know the exact amount because early on the Pentagon said we're not keeping count of the Iraqi dead. We're only going to keep count of the American dead, which kind of gave you an idea of how much value they placed on the lives of the Iraqi people, the people that today they say they've been trying to help all this time. Which was really ironic that they brought all those guys into Abu Ghraib, they abused them, they tortured them, they killed some of them, And they bombed indiscriminately. They killed untold numbers of people. They wouldn't keep count of the dead, but they said this is all in their interests, which I always found interesting, that we're here to help you. We're making sacrifices to help you Iraqi people. And it's interesting you bring up the sanctions because, so much revolves around this country and how the U.S. national security state has treated Iraq. That you've got the partnership with Saddam in the 1980s. So here you have the partnership with the man they would later call the new Hitler. And that was to kill Iranians who had had the audacity to oust the U.S. installed dictatorship there. And then they turned on their partner, Saddam Hussein, in the Persian Gulf War. They go after him. They don't oust him from power. So they impose these brutal sanctions that end up killing untold numbers of children, Iraqi children, from the diseases and illnesses because they had intentionally bombed the water and sewage facilities during the Persian Gulf War. The sanctions ensured that those could not get repaired, so people were drinking this sewage-infested water. The children were dying to the tune of hundreds of thousands. This was engendering this anger and hatred that leads to terrorism in 93 against the World Trade Center, the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the USS Cole, 9/11, and then the 9/11 attacks, which supposedly are because terrorists hate us, our freedom and for our freedom and values. They're there and used to attack this country that had nothing to do with 9/11. As you point out. So these hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, all the people at Abu Ghraib, now all the people that had their homes destroyed, none of them had anything to do with 9/11. I mean, that's what's just so incredible. And that's when they convert this story in this, from this WMD mushroom cloud scenario into the Iraqi people. We love them. And I found it so fascinating how so many Americans just fell right into lockstep with that going from they're about to attack us and this is why we're going in there to kill them to, we're over there killing them to bring them democracy, to bring them freedom. We're sacrificing. And that's when this scenario of our troops are there first they were defending our freedoms, but now they're just selfishly sacrificing themselves for these people. And I find it kind of perverted when now I see them saying, the reason this intervention has failed and ended up in this debacle is the Iraqi people just were not deserving of our graciousness and our sacrifices. If they had been, competent, professional, they would have put together this great society, but now our sacrifices are for naught, all because of them. In other words, the last thing these interventionists are doing, Sheldon, is taking responsibility for this debacle and acknowledging that interventionism is a morally bankrupt philosophy, a destructive philosophy. It needs to be rejected by the American people. It's what we libertarians have said from the get-go, and this is just one more example of why this philosophy, interventionism, should be rejected, along with empire, militarism, foreign wars of aggression, the whole kit and caboodle. Hopefully people will start to see that.
Well, I'm not confident about that. I assume they don't want, I assume the polls will show, just like with Syria, that they don't want the troops sent back in, but we'll see what polls show about, lesser measures. Somebody pointed out this morning that when they talk about boots on the ground and they ruled that out, when the policymakers ruled that out, they don't count special ops and the CIA. I guess those guys don't wear boots. They must be wearing hush puppies or something. They don't count as boots on the ground. We should count them, though. Those are Americans on the ground. And we should also point out that if McCain and those guys had their way, and leaving a force in 2011, past 2011, American force in Iraq, that Americans today would be killing and dying in Iraq. I think we should be pointing that out because McCain, of course, is all over television saying, "I told you so. I told you we took everything out in 2011, like Obama did." That this was going to happen. So he's trying to control the narrative, as Lindsey Graham and the other hawks, the other neocons, are doing. And to some extent, they're succeeding. That they can, they make their case that if we had only done more and not left in 2011, that things wouldn't have been, wouldn't be the way they are today. Now, anyone who thinks that there was some sort of residual force would have, number one, reformed Maliki, or would have been able to push back or prevent this rise of ISIS, I think is almost delusional, because I don't see how a small U.S. force could have done that. And because there was such anger at the regime. Now, let's not forget the Maliki regime fired on and killed peaceful demonstrators a couple of years ago in Fallujah, I think. And today Fallujah is largely under control of the ISIS folks, and they have the second biggest city in the country, Mosul, under their control. And they're marching toward Baghdad. Now, I don't know what this means. Baghdad's going to be a different ball game for ISIS versus the north and the west, because that's the Shiite stronghold, and so it doesn't automatically mean they're going to just go marching through Baghdad. But I think we should keep in mind that if U.S. troops had stayed there, they would be dying and killing. And to go in now, which is what's being talked about, and Obama certainly is leaning to doing something, not ground troops, but airstrikes and other things, just means that the U.S. is identifying itself as on the side of the Shiite government, with some token thing about, hey, Maliki, you better reform yourself. But otherwise it's going to be interpreted as aid to the Shiites, which is just going to once again reinforce for the Sunni that the United States and the American people are the enemy. And who knows? We could see terrorism here, even here, or Europe, other places against Americans, innocent Americans, once again as a result of U.S. policy.
Of course, if they go in there and start taking attack planes and attacking these Sunni forces, they're not going to get angry. They're not going to have that anger and rage that they've had in the past when U.S. intervention and start killing people over there. And then we're going to see the terrorist response, and then the same old nonsense. They hate us for our freedom and values. Oh, by the way, we have to take away your own freedom here. We need more NSA surveillance. We need more CIA monitoring. We need, the giant TSA, Homeland Security. All because it's rooted in this interventionism, and I find it amusing when the conservatives are saying, "Oh, we should have stayed there. That this is all Obama." It's my understanding that it was Bush that negotiated the agreement to get the troops out of there, and Obama was simply complying with the agreement. But what are they saying, Sheldon? That the U.S. should have continued an indefinite occupation of the country, even though the Iraqi government which supposedly is supposed to be independent and sovereign, says get out of our country. I mean, let's face it, the Iraqi regime didn't want the U.S. in there anymore.
Well, that once again is you break it, you own it, you bought it. It's true that it's Bush that signed the Status of Forces agreement that called for the final troops leaving in 2011. But there always was the possibility that the U.S. that if Maliki asked, or the Iraqi government asked for some force to stay on, that could be negotiated. That wasn't ruled out. And Obama was asking them to ask us to stay on. And the deal breaker was that Maliki wanted the U.S. troops subject to Iraqi law if they did anything wrong. And there had been war crimes and atrocities committed there. And so he, I guess, feeling he needed to do this for his own people, he said, okay, some troops can stay, but they are subject to Iraqi law if they commit crimes. And that's a deal breaker. The U.S. never goes for that. The U.S., when it puts troops in foreign countries, always says there'll be any wrongdoing will be handled by the U.S. military. Maliki wouldn't take that. Obama wouldn't take his condition, and therefore the troops left. Now, I don't know what McCain and others wanted them to do. I don't know. In a way, I have to defend Obama on this. If Maliki says they can only come in with this condition, and Obama can't, I don't think McCain would have liked that Maliki's condition either. So what are the Hawks asking for? What do they think should have happened in 2011? If the government, which we're saying is a sovereign government, says you can't stay unless they're subject to Iraqi law, the troops are subject to Iraqi law, what's he going to say? We're staying anyway? And then you start fighting with the Iraqi government? It's a mess. It's a total mess. And to drive home how much of a mess it is, let's remember that de facto we're on the same side as Iran now in this conflict. Iran doesn't like the Sunnis taking over cities in Iraq and moving toward Baghdad. Iran, it's a majority Shiite country. Iran is Shiite. Maliki spent time in exile in Iran. Iran basically handpicked him as to be the president or prime minister of Iraq. They've always been close. He really doesn't need the U.S. because he's got Iran. But now the U.S. is worried that Iran's going to come in to Iraq. And let's go to the other side, to the non-existent Iraq-Syria border. The very people fighting the Maliki government in Iraq are fighting the Assad government in Syria, but we're also against the Assad government in Syria, which means we're on the same side as ISIS in Syria. So when they're on one side of a non-existent border, we're against them. When they're on the other side of that non-existent border, we're on the same side.
Yeah, that
even a scorecard won't help you settle this.
No, you feel like you're in Orwell's 1984, where we're fighting East Asia or Eurasia and the enemies change every day and the American people are expected to keep track of this and know who they're supposed to be supporting. And I bet you not one American in 1,000 understands that when they ousted Saddam Hussein from power, it was a dream come true for the Iranian government. Remember, they had gone to war against this guy in the 80s, so the U.S. ends up installing a regime that is closer to Iran, which is the U.S. government's mortal enemy, than he is to the United States. In fact, one of the amusing things about the U.S. occupation is that whenever the U.S. president flew into Iraq to visit the troops, he'd have to do what he does in Afghanistan today. He'd fly in under, secrecy. The press couldn't know about it, and he'd spend a couple hours with the troops and then vamoose back home. He couldn't even spend the night there. While the Iranian leaders could go into Baghdad and stay in hotels and walk around the streets and not have to worry a bit. It was just the whole thing ended up so perverse. And yeah, you're right. I find it quite fascinating that here the U.S. encourages this rebellion, this revolution in Syria, supporting these people, many of whom include Al Qaeda, and these are the same people that were part of this revolutionary force that have now come into Iraq that we are now opposing. And that Iran is opposing. The whole thing, if that doesn't clearly show the bankruptcy of this whole philosophy of interventionism, I just don't know what does. And the other funny part about this aspect, amusing part, is you see all these neocons and conservatives and interventionists saying, oh, we need to do this. We need to do this. National security is at stake. Not one single one of them, Sheldon, is going over there to Iraq to help the Baghdad government. And there's nothing to preclude them from doing that. You just get on a plane, you go over there, you go into Baghdad and said, I'm here as an American to protect my national security. I'm here to help. Show me where the front lines are. Now, if there was a war here in the United States where some aggressor nation was invading the United States, I think most of us would come to the defense of our country. Well, we all know this thing's bogus about going to Iraq, national security and stuff, but these people really believe that national security is at stake. They really believe that the United States might fall based on what happens in Iraq. Well, why don't they come to the defense of national security instead of saying we, which means the troops? Why don't they go over there and fight themselves? Join up with the Baghdad forces. Protect national security personally. Take personal responsibility for what you've wrought here. And, of course, none of them are going to do that. When they say we need to do this, they're talking about the U.S. government doing something. And that brings up the notion of what do you think is going through the minds of the troops that served in Iraq? They've been inculcated with this notion that, hey, we did a great thing for the Iraqi people. We sacrificed. We defended the Americans' rights and freedoms. We supported and defended the Constitution. They didn't do any of those things, Sheldon. And we've said that from the beginning, that they're over there fighting on behalf of an imperialist force that's over there effecting regime change and producing one giant debacle. And it only goes to show what we said from the beginning. These troops had killed and died for the same purpose that the 58,000 American troops in Vietnam died. They killed and died for nothing, absolutely nothing. And that's the legacy of this thing.
Well, it's nothing except the policymakers' agenda, the military-industrial complex, and don't forget who was the biggest booster of this war, the U.S. government's closest ally in the Middle East, which is Israel. They and their supporters here were pushing for this war. They wanted this war, and the neocons see a total coinciding of interest between the United States in their mind, or at least they rationalize it this way, and Israel. So this was supposed to make peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis too, right? Take out Saddam, and they used to say the road to Jerusalem leads through Baghdad. Well, I'd like to see them travel that road today.
Yeah, well, we're about out of time, and hopefully people will not just come up with some kind of reform measure here of, oh, well, what should we do? Maybe bomb here or stay out here. I mean, really what we're really hoping that people do is look at the whole philosophy of foreign aid, including foreign aid to dictators in the Middle East and elsewhere. The whole idea of embroiling our nation within these internal conflicts and international conflicts, especially in the Middle East, it has just turned out to be one huge debacle. It's time to reevaluate the entire philosophy of interventionism and look at the non-interventionist philosophy of libertarianism. That's the key to peace and prosperity and harmony, unlike what we have today. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.